There is a man sitting on a beach in Brazil. He is working 2 hours a day. He is earning more money than he did when he was working 80 hours a week at a job he hated. He is learning tango in the afternoon, studying languages in the evening, and traveling to a different country every few months. He is not retired. He is not wealthy by inheritance. He did not win the lottery. He built a system, a specific, learnable, replicable system that allows him to live what he calls the rich life, not at the end of a 40-year career, but right now, while he is young enough to enjoy it. That man is Timothy Ferriss, and in 2007, he published a book that made millions of people deeply uncomfortable in the best possible way. The book is called The 4-Hour Workweek. It has sold over 2 million copies. It has been translated into 35 languages. It has been on the New York Times bestseller list for years. And it has inspired more people to quit jobs they hate, start businesses they love, and design lives they actually want to live than perhaps any other business book of the last 2 decades. But here is what most people misunderstand about this book before they read it. It is not a book about working 4 hours a week. It is not a book about being lazy. And it is definitely not a book about shortcuts that let you get something for nothing. It is a book about ruthless efficiency, about questioning assumptions so deeply embedded in modern working culture that most people have never even noticed they are assumptions, about the difference between being busy and being productive, about the difference between deferring your life to some imagined future retirement and actually living it now, and about the specific, practical, actionable steps you can take to start living differently, starting immediately, regardless of your current situation. In the next 15 minutes, we are going to go through every major idea in this book in a way that is honest, practical, and genuinely eye-opening. Because once you see the assumptions Ferriss is challenging, you cannot unsee them. And once you understand the system he built, you will never think about work, time, or freedom the same way again. Let us start with the assumption that Ferriss considers the most damaging of all, the assumption that the goal of life is retirement. Think about the standard narrative of a successful life. You work hard for 40 years. You save diligently. You sacrifice your time, your energy, your best years. And then, somewhere around 65, you finally get to live. You retire. You travel. You do the things you always wanted to do. You live the life you spent 4 decades putting off. Ferriss has several problems with this narrative. Problem 1. It requires you to spend the most physically capable, mentally sharp, energetically abundant years of your life doing something you tolerate in order to fund a future version of yourself who may not be healthy enough, energetic enough, or alive enough to enjoy what you saved for. Problem 2. The math only works if you can accurately predict what you will want at 65 based on what you want at 35, which you cannot. The things that excite you now will not be the things that excite you then. And the things you dream of doing now require the energy and the physicality you have now, not the diminished version you will have after 40 more years of deferred living. Problem 3. If the goal is simply to stop doing work you hate, why wait 40 years to achieve it? Why not design your work so you do not hate it right now? Ferriss introduces a concept he calls the new rich, not people who have accumulated a large net worth, but people who have achieved what he calls the 3 currencies of the ideal lifestyle: time, income, and mobility. The new rich are not necessarily millionaires. They are people who have enough money coming in, with enough freedom over how they spend their time, and enough ability to live and work from anywhere, that their daily life looks like what most people's retirement dreams look like. And they are living it now. Not someday, now. He makes a distinction that fundamentally reframes the entire discussion: the difference between absolute income and relative income. If you earn $100,000 a year, working 80 hours a week, your absolute income is high. But your relative income, your earnings per hour of free time, is actually quite low. If you earn $40,000 a year, working 4 hours a week, your absolute income is lower, but your relative income is extraordinarily high. And when you factor in that a person with genuine time freedom and location freedom can access experiences, travel, and opportunities that a $100,000 a year person working 80 hours a week simply cannot, the $40,000 per year new rich person is actually living a richer life in almost every meaningful sense. This reframing is the first crack in the foundation of conventional thinking, and Ferriss drives more cracks through it with every chapter. Now let us talk about the framework that structures the entire book. Ferriss calls it DEAL. D stands for definition, E stands for elimination, A stands for automation, L stands for liberation. These 4 steps, taken in sequence, are the blueprint for designing and building a 4-hour workweek lifestyle. Let us go through each one. Definition is about rewriting the rules, about questioning the assumptions that have been driving your decisions without your conscious awareness. Ferriss identifies what he calls the most dangerous and most common of these assumptions. He calls them the rules that are not rules. The first false rule is that you need to work hard for decades before you can enjoy the rewards. Ferriss says this confuses correlation with causation. Some successful people worked hard for decades, but the goal is not hard work. The goal is a specific kind of life, and there are faster paths to that life than the conventional one. The second false rule is that retirement is the goal. We have already addressed this. Ferriss replaces the concept of retirement with the concept of mini-retirements. Instead of deferring all of your living to a single block at the end of your life, you distribute it throughout your life. You take 1 month, 3 month, 6 month breaks at various points in your career. You live abroad for a season. You pursue an intense interest for a quarter. You do the living now, interspersed with the working, rather than sequencing them so that all the living comes last. The third false rule is that you need a lot of money to live extraordinarily well. Ferriss demonstrates through personal experience and through the stories of dozens of people he profiles in the book that the actual cost of an extraordinary life, when you have time freedom and location freedom, is often dramatically lower than the cost of a mediocre life in an expensive city working a conventional job. A month living in Southeast Asia, with genuine luxury by local standards, can cost less than a week of ordinary life in New York or London. When you can work from anywhere, the entire world becomes your neighborhood. And some of the most beautiful, most vibrant, most culturally rich neighborhoods in the world are extraordinarily affordable. Now let us move to elimination. This is the section of the book that most people find most immediately actionable. And it starts with a principle that Ferriss did not invent, but applies with unusual ruthlessness. The Pareto Principle, also known as the 80-20 rule. The Pareto Principle states that roughly 80% of your outputs come from 20% of your inputs. 80% of your results come from 20% of your efforts. 80% of your revenue comes from 20% of your customers. 80% of your problems come from 20% of your clients. The ratios are not always exactly 80-20, but the principle that a small minority of inputs produces the overwhelming majority of outputs holds remarkably consistently across almost every domain of business and life. Ferriss asks you to apply this principle with surgical precision to your own work. Which 20% of your activities produces 80% of your results? Which 20% of your clients generates 80% of your revenue? Which 20% of your work, if eliminated, would remove 80% of your headaches and time waste while barely affecting your output? He tells the story of his own business. He was working 80 hours a week, managing hundreds of customers, drowning in emails, and barely profitable. He did the Pareto analysis and discovered that 5 clients out of several hundred were generating 95% of his revenue. He also discovered that his 5 most time-consuming and emotionally draining clients were generating less than 5% of his revenue, while consuming more than half of his time. His response was radical and immediate. He fired the time-consuming clients. He focused everything on the 5 high-value ones. His revenue stayed roughly the same. His working hours dropped by more than 70%. And his stress reduced by a margin he describes as almost unbelievable. Connected to the Pareto Principle is the application of Parkinson's Law. Parkinson's Law states that work expands to fill the time allotted for its completion. If you give yourself a week to complete a task that could realistically be done in 2 hours, it will somehow take a week. The emails will multiply. The revisions will proliferate. The meetings will appear. The task will grow to fill the container you have given it. Ferriss uses Parkinson's Law as an aggressive productivity tool. He deliberately sets impossibly short deadlines. He constrains the time available for tasks, and finds that the constraints force a clarity and an efficiency that open-ended timeframes never produce. If you have 2 hours to do something instead of 2 days, you immediately identify what is actually essential and discard everything that is not. You stop perfecting and start completing. You stop discussing and start deciding. The constraint is not a burden. It is a filter. And the filter makes you dramatically more productive than you would be with unlimited time. The elimination section also addresses one of the most insidious productivity killers in modern work: email. Ferriss makes a case against the tyranny of constant email checking that feels almost heretical in a culture that treats instant responsiveness as a professional virtue. He argues that checking email constantly does not make you productive. It makes you reactive. It keeps you perpetually in other people's agendas rather than your own. It fragments your attention into pieces too small for deep work. And it creates the illusion of busyness without the substance of productivity. His solution is radical but logical. Check email twice a day, once at noon and once at 4 in the afternoon. Outside of those times, the email client is closed, notifications are off, and he adds an autoresponder that informs anyone who emails him of this policy, and gives them a phone number for genuine emergencies. He acknowledges that this feels terrifying to most people before they try it, and he reports that after trying it, almost everyone discovers that almost nothing that felt urgent actually was. The world does not end when you do not respond to an email within the hour. Business does not collapse. Relationships do not fracture. And the quality and depth of the work done in the hours previously consumed by email monitoring improves dramatically. He applies similar thinking to meetings. Meetings, Ferriss argues, are one of the greatest sources of time waste in modern organizational life. They are convened not because they are the most efficient way to achieve an outcome, but because they are the most socially comfortable way to appear engaged. He suggests a radical filtering criterion for every meeting. Does this meeting have a clear, specific agenda? Does it have a defined end time? And is there a decision that needs to be made that cannot be made any other way? If the answer to any of these is no, the meeting should not happen. Now, let us move to automation. This is the section where Ferriss introduces the concept that most dramatically separates his approach from conventional productivity advice. And it starts with a question that most people have never seriously asked themselves. What would happen if you stopped doing the things on your to-do list and instead arranged for them to be done by someone else? Ferriss introduces the concept of the virtual assistant, a remote worker, often based in a country where labor costs are lower, who can handle a wide range of administrative, research, and logistical tasks for a fraction of what it would cost to hire locally. He describes delegating tasks like email filtering, travel research and booking, appointment scheduling, online research, data entry, and dozens of other time-consuming but low-skill activities, to virtual assistants who handle them remotely. The key insight here is about the value of your time. If your time is worth $50 an hour in terms of the value it can produce, and you are spending that time on tasks that could be handled by someone charging $5 an hour, you are destroying $45 of value for every hour you spend on those tasks. Delegation is not laziness. It is the economically rational allocation of the most valuable and least replaceable resource you have, your time. Ferriss extends this concept to business. He describes the concept of the muse, a simple, automated, cash-generating business that runs largely without your involvement. Not a passion project, not a startup with venture capital ambitions, a simple product or service business, usually information-based or physical product-based, that can be run with minimal human intervention through the use of outsourced fulfillment, customer service, and operations. He walks through the specific steps for building a muse. First, identify a market niche with a specific, concrete problem, not a broad category, but a narrow, specific community of people with a specific, identifiable need. Second, create or source a product that addresses that need. Ferriss has a strong preference for information products, online courses, books, and guides, because they can be created once and sold indefinitely with no inventory and no marginal cost per unit. Third, build a simple online presence and test demand before investing significantly in the product. Fourth, automate order processing, payment, fulfillment, and customer service using a combination of software tools and virtual assistants. Fifth, step back, monitor the system, make adjustments, and work only when the system needs human intervention, which in a well-designed muse is rare. He is very clear that building a muse is not easy. It requires upfront work, creativity, and a willingness to test and fail and iterate. But it is finite work with an ongoing payoff. Unlike a conventional job, where you trade time for money in an endless loop, a muse creates a system that generates income whether you are working or not. And that income buys you the time and freedom that make everything else in the book possible. Now let us talk about liberation, the final step in the deal framework, and the one that most people, even those who are intellectually convinced by everything that comes before it, find most psychologically difficult to actually execute. Liberation is about breaking free from the physical and psychological anchors that keep you tied to a conventional work structure. And the biggest of those anchors for most people is the office. The expectation that work requires physical presence in a specific location for a specific number of hours each day. Ferriss describes a strategy for negotiating remote work with a conventional employer that is both bold and methodical. He calls it testing the muse while keeping the leash. Before making any dramatic announcements or confrontational demands, you demonstrate your value as a remote worker by making yourself indispensable, then engineering a situation where you must work remotely for a short period, proving during that period that your productivity actually increases when you work from home, and then leveraging that proven track record to negotiate a permanent remote arrangement. He acknowledges that not every employer will agree, and for those who will not, he is direct about the implication. An employer who insists on your physical presence in an office, even when you have demonstrated that you are more productive without it, is not valuing your output. They are valuing your presence. They are managing visibility rather than results. And an organization that manages visibility rather than results is not an organization that will ever give you the freedom you are trying to design your life around. In which case, the muse becomes not a supplement to your income, but a replacement for it. Liberation also addresses the most common psychological obstacle to implementing everything in this book. The fear that you are indispensable. The belief that if you are not available, if you are not checking email constantly, if you are not in the office every day, everything will fall apart. Ferriss calls this the superstar complex, and he systematically dismantles it. He describes the experiment of the planned disappearance. You take a 2-week vacation with no email and no phone contact with the office. You prepare your team as thoroughly as you can beforehand, and then you disappear. And what almost everyone who does this discovers is that almost everything gets handled. Not perfectly, but adequately. And the few things that genuinely required your specific input waited until you returned. Your team grew stronger. Your colleagues became more capable, and the business did not collapse. Because businesses are systems, and systems do not depend on any single individual, as much as that individual flatters themselves to believe. Now let us bring everything together, because the 4-Hour Workweek is not ultimately a book about productivity hacks, or business automation, or remote work strategies, even though it provides extraordinarily practical guidance on all of those things. It is a book about a fundamental question that most people never ask clearly enough to answer honestly. The question is this: what would you do if you were not afraid? Not what should you do, not what is the responsible choice. What would you actually do with your one life if the fear of failure, the fear of judgment, the fear of financial insecurity were removed from the equation? Ferriss argues that most people have never seriously asked this question. They have asked instead, how do I advance within the conventional structure? How do I get the next promotion? How do I save enough to retire? How do I optimize my performance within a system I never consciously chose? These are reasonable questions, but they are the wrong questions if the system itself is not designed around what you actually want. He tells the story of his own life before the 4-Hour Workweek. He was running a sports nutrition supplement company. He was working 80 hours a week. He was profitable. He was successful by every conventional metric. And he was miserable. He had built a prison and called it a business. And the moment of liberation came not from working harder or smarter within the existing structure, but from stepping back far enough to see the structure itself, and ask whether it was actually serving the life he wanted. The practical lessons are clear and actionable. Redefine success not as the accumulation of money over 40 years, but as the design of a life you love living right now. Apply the 80-20 rule ruthlessly to your work. Identify the small number of activities that produce the overwhelming majority of your results, and focus on those. Eliminate or delegate everything else. Use Parkinson's law as a productivity weapon by constraining your time rather than expanding it. Build a muse that generates income independent of your hourly input. Negotiate or design location independence so your work can happen anywhere. And then use the time and freedom you have created to pursue the things that actually make you feel alive. Not someday, now. Ferriss is honest about one thing that the title of the book obscures. The goal is not to work as little as possible. The goal is to work only on things that matter, that leverage your unique abilities, that create real value, that you would do even if the financial reward were smaller than it is. The 4-Hour Workweek is not a cap on ambition. It is a filter for it. A way of eliminating the noise so that what remains is signal. Pure, focused, meaningful work that you actually want to do. He ends the book with a challenge that is simultaneously the simplest and the most difficult thing he asks of you. He asks you to define your nightmare, to write down the absolute worst-case scenario that would result from making the change you most want to make, to look at it honestly and ask whether it is actually as catastrophic as your fear makes it feel, and then to ask whether the cost of not making the change, of spending 5 more years, 10 more years, 20 more years in the situation you are in right now, is actually lower than the cost of the worst-case scenario you are afraid of. In almost every case, the answer is no. The nightmare is survivable. The cost of inaction is far higher than the cost of the worst case, and the upside, The actual potential of a life designed around what you genuinely want, rather than what you were told to want, is almost always higher than you allow yourself to imagine. The beach in Brazil is real. The 2-hour workday is real. The language classes in the afternoon and the tango in the evening are real. Not for some special category of person, born with advantages you do not have. For anyone willing to question the rules they were handed, build the systems that serve them, and have the courage to actually live the life they keep telling themselves they will live someday. Someday is not a day of the week, but today is.